In the winter of 1878, 16 men walked into a Michigan logging camp with enough salted and smoked pork to last through February. They had done everything right. The meat was brown on the outside. It smelled like hickory and salt. Every single one of those men was dead or dying before the thaw came. The bears got the blame. The bears did not do it. Those 16 men were not careless, not green. These were working loggers, hard men who lived outdoors from November to April and had done it before. They knew how to salt a barrel and hang a ham and read smoke the way a sailor reads wind. And they died anyway. Because there was one belief so deep in the bones of pioneer food culture that nobody questioned it. Nobody wrote against it. Everyone from the trapper on the Yellowstone to the farm wife in the Carolina hills already knew it was true. If the meat is salty, if the meat is smoky, if it is brown on the outside and cold in the barrel, the meat is safe. That belief killed more pioneers than every bear, blizzard, and river crossing combined. My name is Levi Blackwood. 7th generation on Blackwood Ridge in the southern Appalachians. My grandfather Harlan kept a leather journal from 1936 until the week he died. He wrote in it the way other men pray. When he wrote something down, it was because it was true, and because he was afraid it would not get passed on. He made me copy it into a second journal when I was 14. Kitchen table, wood stove ticking, cup of coffee. I was not technically old enough to be drinking. He said the hands that write a thing remember it different than the eyes that read it. He was right. He usually was. This is that story. What the myth was first. You need to understand what the myth actually was, where it came from, why it made sense, because this was not a stupid belief. That is the thing. That is why it lasted so long and killed so many people. It was a belief built on real observation, real experience, and real results. It was right about almost everything. Almost. Picture a frontier kitchen in 1840. Ohio maybe, or Kentucky. Does not matter. The woman standing at the table has been feeding a family off a single hog all winter, and she has not lost anyone to bad meat in 15 years. She knows what she is doing. She knows salt draws moisture out of tissue and creates an environment where bacteria cannot take hold. She knows smoke deposits antimicrobial compounds on the surface of the meat. She knows cold storage slows spoilage to nearly nothing. She knows that meat kept in a cold brine barrel smells clean, feels firm, and looks right when it comes out of the cure. And she is correct about every single one of those things. The problem is not what she knows. The problem is what she does not know exists. Because in 1840, nobody had a name for Trichinella spiralis. Nobody had a microscope powerful enough to find it in a slice of infected muscle. Nobody had identified it as the thing killing people in logging camps and hunting parties and military bivouacs from the Adirondacks to the Rockies. What they had instead were explanations that made sense with the information available. The meat sat out too long before it hit the barrel. The brine went weak. The smokehouse ran too hot. The man was already sick when he ate it. And when none of those explanations fit, and the meat looked perfectly fine, and the brine was strong, and the smokehouse ran cold, and the man was healthy. Monday morning and dead by Friday, well, the camp was near a creek bottom, where bear sign was heavy. The bear got the story. The parasite got away clean. And I want to be fair here, because the men and women who built this country were not fools. They were working with incomplete information in a world that had not yet given them the tools to find the thing that was killing them. You cannot see a worm the size of a comma with your naked eye. You cannot smell it. You cannot taste it. You cannot feel it in the meat when you press your thumb against the grain. Every single sense you own will tell you the meat is fine. Your senses are wrong. The bear alibi. Let us talk about how the bear got away with it. Bears killed people on the frontier. That part is true. A man running a trap line in the Michigan pines in the 1870s was living in genuine proximity to animals that could, and occasionally did, cause serious harm. Loggers and trappers had legitimate reasons to think about bears as a threat. So when men in a logging camp started dying after a winter of eating from the barrel, and the camp sat in bear country, the explanation assembled itself almost automatically. Bad bear. Bad luck. Nothing to be done differently next time. The problem is that trichinosis does not look like a bear attack. Not even close. A bear attack is immediate and obvious and leaves marks. Trichinosis starts quiet. Stomach trouble first, the kind a man attributes to bad water or a hard week. Then fever and muscle pain creeping in over days, the kind a man pushes through because loggers in the 1870s did not stop working over a little fever and sore muscles. By the time a man was sick enough that everyone knew something was seriously wrong, it had been 2 weeks since he ate the contaminated meat. Nobody was connecting the salt pork from 3 Sundays back to the man lying in his bunk, unable to lift his arms. They were connecting it to the bear tracks they had seen near camp in November. Harlan had a name for this kind of thinking. He called it blaming the boots for the blister when it was the sock that did it. I heard that phrase about twice a week growing up. Took me until I was 30 to fully appreciate how often it applied. The medical record is not ambiguous. By the 1880s, physicians were tracing these deaths directly to undercooked meat. The knowledge existed. In the journals, in the literature. It just never reached the camp cook. And the bear kept getting the credit. The salt lie. Let us talk about salt, because salt is where the myth does the most convincing. Salt curing is one of the oldest food preservation methods in human history, not folklore. Documented fact going back to ancient Egypt, the Roman legions, the Norse fishing villages, every culture on Earth that needed to keep protein from rotting before refrigeration existed. Salt works through osmosis. It pulls water out of bacterial cells, creates a brine environment where spoilage bacteria cannot survive, and genuinely does what the frontier believed it did. It stops the rot. It really does. A properly brined ham at the right concentration in a cold barrel at 36 to 40 degrees will hold for months without spoiling. The United States Department of Agriculture farm bulletins from the early 1900s confirmed it in writing. The science is real. The method works. Here is what salt does not do. Salt does not kill Trichinella spiralis. The parasite insists itself in muscle tissue, wraps itself in a collagen capsule, and sits there, waiting. It is not a bacterium. It does not need free water to survive. You can submerge infected pork in a saturated salt brine for 6 weeks and pull it out with every cyst intact, alive, and ready to move into the next person who eats it. The 1890s. Army medical literature documented trichinosis outbreaks specifically in salt-cured pork processed correctly by every standard of the day. Brine at the right strength. Cure ran the right number of days. Men still got sick. Harlan wrote about a family 3 ridges over. 1922. Careful people. 40 years of curing without losing a single batch. That winter they lost 2 children. The county doctor called it intestinal fever. He was being polite. The pork was 2 months in the barrel, perfectly cured, fried on a cast iron skillet on a January morning. The outside smelled exactly right. The inside killed 2 children by February. Harlan underlined the next line 3 times. The salt got the rot. It did not get the worm. Those are 2 different enemies, and you only get to be wrong about one of them. The smoke lie. Now the smoke. If salt is the first pillar of the frontier preservation myth, smoke is the second. And smoke is even more convincing than salt because smoke does something salt cannot do. Smoke changes the way the meat looks. Smoke changes the way the meat smells. Smoke lays a visible, aromatic, sensory coat over the entire surface of the ham, or the bacon side, or the venison haunch, and it announces to every sense you own that this meat has been treated. This meat is protected. This meat is safe. And here again, the frontier was not wrong about what smoke actually does. Cold smoke at temperatures below 90 degrees deposits phenols and aldehydes and organic acids on the surface of the meat. Those compounds genuinely do inhibit surface mold. They genuinely do slow surface bacteria. A properly cold smoked ham has a surface that is chemically hostile to the organisms that would otherwise colonize it. You can see it, the dark, dry, leathery rind of a well-smoked country ham. That is not just color. That is chemistry. The smoke works. The surface protection is real. Here is what smoke does not do. Smoke does not penetrate. Cold smoke, the kind the frontier used because a hot smokehouse would cook the meat rather than cure it. Cold smoke deposits its protective compounds in the outer few millimeters of the meat, maybe a quarter inch on a long cure. The center of a 12-pound ham after 3 days of cold smoke is chemically identical to what it was before it ever went in the smokehouse. The smoke never reached it. The smoke could not reach it. That is not a failure of the method. That is just physics. Smoke does not diffuse through inches of dense muscle the way salt brine slowly does. And Trichinella spiralis, encysted in the muscle fibers 3 inches from the surface, has never once in the history of the world been troubled by phenols drifting past the outer rind. There is a detail that makes this particularly cruel. The smell of a well-smoked piece of meat is one of the most reassuring smells a human being can encounter. I mean that literally. There is research on this. The Maillard reaction compounds in smoked meat trigger a deep, instinctive response in the human brain that reads as safe, as home, as food. Your nose is wired to love that smell because for most of human history, cooked preserved meat was good meat. The worm does not care what it smells like. The surface is beautiful. The inside is a lottery. And the frontier cook standing at the smokehouse door pulling a ham that has been in the cold smoke for 5 days, smelling that extraordinary smell, seeing that perfect dark rind, had no mechanism available to them to know the difference between a clean ham and a contaminated one. None. The cold lie. The third pillar of the myth is cold. And cold is the most seductive lie of all because cold does the most work. The frontier understood cold in a practical, intimate way that most people living in the age of the Frigidaire have completely lost. Cold is free refrigeration. Cold is the difference between a carcass that keeps and a carcass that does not. Cold is the reason you butcher in November and not in September. The reason the barrel goes in the cellar and not next to the cook stove. The reason the old farmers watched the weather the way we watch our phones. And they were right. Cold slows bacterial growth to nearly nothing at 36 to 40 degrees. Cold keeps a barrel of brine from souring. Cold is a genuine, effective, essential part of the frontier preservation system. And here is the belief that grew naturally out of that truth. The belief that cost people their lives. If cold slows the bad things down, then colder must stop them entirely. And if you leave the meat cold long enough, the cold must eventually finish what the salt and smoke started. I heard this belief stated out loud as recently as 2009. A man at a church supper in this county. Good man. Smart man. Told me his grandfather always said a ham left in a cold enough cellar long enough was as safe as a cooked one because the cold eventually killed everything in it. It does not. Trichinella spiralis larvae, encysted in muscle tissue, can survive temperatures well below freezing for weeks. The parasite's cyst wall is specifically adapted to protect it during the cold winters its host animals, the bears and the hogs and the wild boar, routinely experience. The cyst is not surprised by cold. The cyst has been surviving cold for millions of years. Cold is the parasite's home climate. It practically has a rocking chair on the porch down there. The Centers for Disease Control documented trichinosis cases from frozen bear meat in Alaska as recently as 1985. Frozen, solid. Stored at temperatures well below what any frontier seller could achieve. The cysts survived anyway. Now there's a footnote here because I believe in giving you the complete picture. Commercial pork today is frozen at -10 degrees Fahrenheit for a specified period under federally approved protocols, and this does kill Trichinella. But that is -10 for weeks in a controlled environment. Not the 32 or 35 degrees of a springhouse cellar. Not the 20-degree cold snap that freezes the creek bottom for 2 weeks in January and then breaks. The frontier cellar was cold. It was not cold enough. And the frontier did not know the difference because nobody had yet told them there was a difference to know. The color lie. The fourth lie is the one that feels the most personal, because it is the lies you tell yourself in the moment. Right there at the fire. Right there with the skillet sizzling and the smell rising and 16 hungry men waiting, and you are tired and cold and ready to eat. The lie is color. The frontier cook's visual test for safe pork was simple and intuitive, and based on a lifetime of correct observations in every situation except this one. If the outside is brown, if the fat is rendered and golden, if the meat closest to the surface has gone from pink to gray, the meat is done and the meat is safe. And here's where I have to tell you something that food scientists will confirm, and that took me a while to really absorb when I first understood it. Color is not temperature. Myoglobin, the protein that gives pork and venison and bear meat its pink color, changes color in response to heat. But it does not change color at the same temperature that kills Trichinella. It does not change color at a consistent temperature at all. Myoglobin can retain its pink color at fully safe temperatures. It can turn gray at temperatures that are still dangerous. The color of the meat and the internal temperature of the meat are related, but they are not the same measurement, and one does not reliably predict the other. A pork roast can be fully cooked to 145 degrees with a slight pink blush remaining in the center. Perfectly safe. A pork roast can be completely gray throughout at temperatures that never reached 100. Potentially dangerous if Trichinella is present. The frontier cook looking at a slice of pork and seeing gray from edge to edge and pronouncing it done was sometimes right and sometimes not, and had no way to tell the difference. And here is the part that makes this specific lie so lethal on the frontier specifically. The cuts they were eating were not thin pork chops. They were salt pork slabs, thick bacon sides, chunks cut off a cured ham boiled briefly in a pot over a fire and served warm in the center. Thick cuts cooked by experienced people over unpredictable open fires with no thermometers and no way to measure anything except appearance and instinct. The outside was always done. The outside was always right. The inside was a coin flip. The real killer, Trichinella spiralis. Let us name the thing now. Let us put it plainly because it deserves to be said clearly. Trichinella spiralis is a parasitic roundworm. It is small enough that you cannot see it without magnification. It lives in the muscle tissue of infected animals, primarily pigs, wild boar, bear, cougar, and several other species that were central to the frontier diet. The adult worm reproduces in the small intestine of an infected host. The larvae migrate through the bloodstream and insist in skeletal muscle, where they can remain viable and infectious for years. When a person consumes infected meat that has not been raised to a sufficient kill temperature, the cysts dissolve in stomach acid. The larvae emerge, mature, reproduce, and the cycle begins in a new host. The resulting disease, trichinosis, starts with gastrointestinal symptoms. Nausea, cramping, diarrhea within the first week. Then, as the larvae migrate into the muscle tissue, fever, severe muscle pain, swelling around the eyes, weakness that can progress to difficulty breathing and in serious infections, heart involvement, and death. The frontier called it any number of things: intestinal fever, meat fever, camp sickness, muscle rheumatism in the cases where men survived the acute phase but were left with chronic pain, They did not know what they were looking for because they did not know what they had. The first scientific description of Trichinella spiralis was published in 1835 by James Paget and Richard Owen, working in London. The connection between the parasite and human disease from eating infected meat was not firmly established in American medical literature until the 1870s and 80s, decades after the frontier preservation myth had been encoded into the bones of every farm family from Georgia to Oregon. And here is the bitter irony of the timeline. The 16 men in the Michigan logging camp died in 1878. The same decade American medicine was finally beginning to understand what had been killing men in logging camps and hunting parties for 50 years. The knowledge existed. In the journals. In the medical literature. It had just not reached the camp cook standing over a skillet in the pines with snow coming on and 16 hungry men behind her. There are animal species in the frontier diet where trichinella rates ran extraordinarily high. Bear is the primary one. The United States Centers for Disease Control puts trichinella prevalence in wild black bear at somewhere between 2 and 10% of tested animals, varying by region. Wild boar runs similarly high in some populations. These were not rare edge cases. A logging camp in the Michigan pines in the 1870s eating bear meat through the winter was eating trichinosis on a regular basis and calling it bad luck when men got sick. The bear really was killing them, just not with its claws. The one thing that actually works now. Here is the thing they got right. Here is the piece of the frontier food tradition that was correct all along and just did not know it was correct for the right reason. The frontier cooks who said cook it until there is no pink anywhere were almost right. The instinct was sound. The execution was inconsistent. And inconsistent is the word that matters because a parasite does not grade on a curve. What kills Trichinella spiralis is heat. Sustained heat applied throughout the full interior of the meat. Modern federal guidance from the Food Safety and Inspection Service puts the kill temperature for Trichinella at 145 degrees Fahrenheit for whole muscle cuts with a 3-minute rest time. 160 degrees for ground meat. Those numbers are not conservative estimates with extra margin built in. Those are the temperatures at which the parasite is reliably, completely, every single time dead. 145 degrees Fahrenheit held for 3 minutes. That is the whole answer. That is the piece of information that would have kept 16 men in the Michigan pines alive through the winter of 1878. Not more salt, not more smoke, not a colder cellar or a longer cure or a better brine. One number, one thermometer, 3 minutes. The tragedy is that thermometers existed in 1878. Not the instant read probe you can buy for $15 at any hardware store today, but thermometers existed, temperature measurement existed, and the medical knowledge that Trichinella died at sustained heat was beginning to circulate in the literature. It just had not made it to the camp cook. There is a specific habit among the old-time mountain families that Harlan documented in his journal, and that I think was doing more work than the people practicing it ever understood. The habit was boiling salt pork before adding it to anything else. Beans, greens, pots of whatever was going in the pot that day. The salt pork went in first, in water, and it boiled. For a long time. Not a quick blanch. A genuine rolling boil for the better part of an hour. Harlan wrote that his grandmother did it because it drew out the excess salt and made the meat less harsh on the palate. That was the reason she gave. That was the reason that had been handed down. But what that boiling actually did, what it accomplished beyond the salt reduction, was raise the interior temperature of every piece of salt pork she ever served to well over 200 degrees for a sustained period of time. She never lost anyone to bad pork. She thought it was because she was careful about her brine. She was right about being careful. She was wrong about which careful habit was doing the actual work. The men in the Michigan pine country were frying their salt pork. Brown on the outside, warm in the middle, pull it off the fire, eat it. The outside was hitting 200 degrees. The interior was hitting maybe 100, maybe. On a cold morning with a fire that had been running on wet wood, maybe less. 90 more seconds over the fire with the pan covered would have changed everything. 90 seconds, and 16 men eat supper and go back to work come morning. The vindication. Here is the vindication. And I mean this in the clearest possible terms. The frontier families who made it through generation after generation without losing people to bad pork were not lucky. They were not tougher. They did not have some innate immunity the logging camp men lacked. They had habits. Specific, identifiable, traceable habits that happened to accomplish the one thing that actually mattered. They cooked the interior through. Every time. Not because they knew about Trichinella. Because their grandmothers had taught them that pork required a full cook, not a sear and serve, and they had followed that teaching without fully understanding why it was right. The women who boiled their salt pork before the pot. The cooks who braised their hams low and slow for hours in a covered Dutch oven until a fork went in clean to the bone. The families who finished their smoked bacon in a covered skillet until it was genuinely crisp all the way through. These people were protected not by the salt and not by the smoke, but by the last step that tied the whole process together. Salt slows the rot. Smoke finishes the surface. Cold holds the cure. Heat kills the worm. 4 steps. The frontier knew 3 of them cold. The 4th one they knew too, some of them, some of the time, in some kitchens. But they did not know they knew it. They did not know that the reason grandmother's pork never hurt anyone was specifically because grandmother never pulled it off the fire too soon. They thought it was the barrel. It was the fire. And in the camps, in the logging operations, in the hunting parties, in the places where men cooked for themselves quickly over open fires without the kitchen traditions that had been quietly protecting family farmsteads for generations, the fire got cut short. The skillet came off too soon. The interior never reached the number it needed to reach. The Journal of Infectious Diseases published a retrospective analysis in 2009 on historical trichinosis outbreaks in North America. The pattern that emerged from the historical records was consistent. Outbreaks clustered in exactly the situations I just described. Male-dominated camps without established kitchen traditions. Quick cooking methods applied to thick cuts. Bear and wild pork, which carry higher parasite loads than domestic animals raised in confinement. The farmhouse kitchen had worked out the solution empirically over generations and never written down why it worked. The logging camp never got the memo. So here is where we land. The frontier preservation system, the salt, the smoke, the cold barrel, the spring house, the whole inherited craft your great-grandmother ran on instinct. That system is real and it works and it is worth knowing. Every piece of it. I will defend it against any food scientist who wants to call it primitive because the record does not support that conclusion for the families that ran the full method correctly. But correctly includes the fire. Salt does the rot. Smoke does the surface. Cold does the hold. Heat does the kill. Miss the last one, and you have a beautiful barrel of cured pork that will feed you perfectly right up until it does not. The parasite does not negotiate. It does not care how good the smokehouse smells, or how long the ham sat in brine. It has one weakness and you have to use it every single time. 145 degrees, 3-minute rest, every cut of pork, every piece of game, every time. Buy a probe thermometer. $15 at any hardware store. That is the whole entry ticket. Not because the old ways failed, because the old ways were 90% of the answer, and the last 10% is $15.30 at the stove. Harlan wrote one line at the end of that 3-page section, triple underlined. And it is the truest thing I have ever read about frontier survival and the myth that killed more pioneers than anything with teeth and claws ever managed. The salt got the rot. It did not get the worm. The barrel is not the last step. The fire is. Your grandfather knew that. Somebody just did not get the chance to pass it down to you. That is what I was here for tonight. Keep the old ways. Just finish them with fire.